Hi, my name's Father Dan Cambra, and I'm a Marian of the Immaculate Conception, the religious community that operates the National Shrine of the Divine Mercy here in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And today, I'd like to talk to you about St. Camillus de Lellis. St. Camillus was born about the middle of the 16th century and died in 1614. He is the founder of the religious community known as the Camillians. They are a hospitaller community. They run hospitals both here in the United States and throughout Europe and Africa. They are the community that's normally thought of as wearing black with a red cross over their hearts. This simple outfit of theirs, however, evolved into a white habit for the ones who worked full-time in the hospitals as doctors, nurses, and orderlies, again with the red cross over their heart. A tertiary order or lay community grew up in helping the Camillians, and they too wore a white outfit with a red cross. This eventually evolved into what we now refer to as the Red Cross Society. And that in turn gave birth to the Red Crescent communities in the Muslim community. St. Camillus's concern and love for the sick, however, was not where his story begins. His story begins, he's a wealthy young man, and much like the young man in the gospel that comes to his father and asks for his inheritance early on in life, he did just that. He asked for his inheritance early on in life. And as a relatively young man, maybe his late teens, he took off to find his fortune in the world. And after a little bit of excessive wine, women, and song, and a little bit of dice play, he very quickly found his life going downhill. St. Camillus, in his early 20s, became so addicted to dice games and to gambling that he found himself at one point playing dice, rolling for his boots. And when he lost his boots, he found himself at the bottom of his life. At the age of 25, he found himself confronted with the reality that he no longer had his monetary inheritance. There were no women who were interested in him. He couldn't afford any more wine or song, or now that he had even lost his boots, he had nothing to gamble with. Where was he going to eat? Well, he went to what was then a rather primitive hospital, and he offered his services in exchange for food. That seemed to work well for him, and he rather enjoyed helping the sick. He then took it the next step and became an employee at the place. And before long, he found himself finding ways to make the lives of the sick even more pleasant. As he became concerned with what appeared to be poor hygiene, he did what he could to improve the hygiene in the hospital itself. And as time went on, people recognized what a good servant of the sick he was. And they placed him in charge of the hospital and in charge of training others to care for the sick. This grew into a religious community that we now refer to as the St. Camillian community. The Camillians, as they're known in the United States, operating hospitals in Chicago, Milwaukee, and throughout the rest of the country. But this was not the end of his story. The end of his story results in his founding not just one or two hospitals, but over 30 hospitals in his lifetime. And not just a few religious men gathered around him, but literally thousands who saw in him the perfect example of how one can love God by loving one's neighbor, and loving them especially in the sick and the downtrodden, those who are most in need. He cared for the elderly, he cared for the indigent, he cared for orphans, and most of all, he brought love into their lives, because in him they recognized not simply somebody who could care for them, but they found in his eyes the love of Christ. Through his intercession and through the intercession of all the saints, may God Almighty bless you and all those whom you love.